This is the Coronavirus Morning Report for Monday, May 4th, 2020. I'm Brian McCullough. This week begins the great reopening experiment. On today's show, we take a deep breath and look at three of our biggest concerns about all of that. Also, why does the virus wallop some places and spare others? Accurate comparisons of coronavirus deaths to flu deaths, and what offices might look like after the lockdown is over. TLDR, the cubicle is back. So yes, as we're going to discuss later, this week marks the big week of cautious reopening in many U.S. states, but also across the world. Italy, for example, which was the big hotspot when we began this show all those weeks ago, is reopening some of its airports. Quoting from the New York Times, in Germany, where widespread testing has kept the pandemic under control, children will return to schools. Austria also plans to restart its school system. In Lebanon, bars and restaurants will reopen, while Poland plans to allow patrons to return to hotels, museums, and shops. India allowed businesses, local transportation, and activities like weddings to resume in areas with few or no known infections. Wedding ceremonies with fewer than 50 guests would be permitted, and self-employed workers like maids and plumbers can return to work, end quote. Spain is beginning to ease its lockdown after 7 weeks of confinement, after reporting a minuscule 0.4% increase in new coronavirus cases over the weekend. Quoting the Washington Post, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez said on Sunday that the number of new recorded deaths from COVID-19 was just 164 fatalities, the lowest one-day increase figure since March 18th. Spain went into lockdown on March 14th and is only just beginning to take steps to ease the strict limitations placed on citizens, end quote. The list of states that are partially reopening or never had lockdowns to begin with is too numerous to mention. So I'm going to mention the states that are maintaining most of their lockdown restrictions, at least for now. Those are Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada, New Mexico, Illinois, Louisiana, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. Every other state in the nation is at least reopening to some degree. We told you recently that the city of Los Angeles declared that they would begin testing for free anyone who wanted to be tested for the coronavirus. You'll never believe what happened next, quoting the New York Times. A website set up by the city of Los Angeles for residents to get tested for the coronavirus, regardless of whether they had symptoms, encountered some growing pains after being deluged with visitors. Some Los Angelinos complained on social media that there were no time slots available on the website, which states that testing is available by appointment only, with priority given to frontline workers and people with symptoms of COVID-19. The tests are free for all residents of Los Angeles County, which is collaborating with the city on the effort. All of the appointments for Monday and Tuesday have been booked, according to the mayor's office, which advised residents to keep checking for slots. The city and county have the capacity to do 18,000 tests a day across 34 sites, Los Angeles officials said, end quote. You know, when we repeat over and over again that testing capacity is not yet where it needs to be, this might be the most concrete proof of that yet. If you locally could be tested right now for free, wouldn't you do so? Wouldn't you make use of that just for peace of mind? And yet, the first place to actually offer that can't keep up with demand, so maybe we're not at capacity yet. And real quick, beginning this week, Whole Foods will give shoppers at all of its stores free disposable face masks, all as part of its plan that was announced last week to ensure everyone inside its 500 stores has their faces covered. Over the weekend, I read a piece in New York Magazine's Intelligencer that crystallized a lot of things about the next few weeks and months for me. The article is wide-ranging, hitting a bunch of topics, and it is on the political side. I'll warn you in case that's not your thing. But let me sum up 3 big worries that this article brought into focus for me. So, all right, places in this country and elsewhere are all coming out of lockdown. It begins this week in earnest, despite the fact that a lot of states in the U.S. are just now hitting their peak case numbers and peak death numbers. And the U.S. in general has merely plateaued at pretty close to peak numbers across the board. For example, last month, April, We went from a recorded 3,800 corona deaths nationwide to a total of 62,000. Again, just in 30 days. So roughly, we went from 3,800 deaths in a month to 59,000 deaths in a month. As I've said before, I assumed all along that we would only begin reopening the country when numbers were dropping significantly, like maybe after we saw a month of only 10,000 deaths down from a month of 60,000 deaths, or a commensurate drop in new cases maybe. But that's not the case. Even in the places where cases and deaths aren't actually rising, like in Spain, as I just mentioned in the previous segment, they're still merely plateauing. I mean, right now in the U.S., we're routinely seeing 2,000 deaths every single day, 3,000 deaths on bad days. And we're routinely seeing upwards of 30,000 new cases every single day. Think about that. 30,000 new people will likely get coronavirus today. But okay, we're beginning to reopen. Fine. The first thing that this piece crystallized for me about all that was the answer to this question. When will we know if this reopening experiment has worked out or not? Quite simply, we should know in about 3 weeks. And we'll know because we might see a surge in new cases hitting hospitals by that point. And by the end of the month, if we see the death numbers rising above plateau, then we'll know that this was a mistake. Quoting from the piece, the basic rule of thumb is that it takes a little less than a week from the time of infection to the arrival of real symptoms. Another week or so until those symptoms become serious enough to require hospitalization for those who do require it. And a week or two from there until those who ultimately die will die. That means the full life cycle of the disease. As we understand it is about a month, end quote. So we will know a month from now if this all was a big gamble that paid off or one that merely reopened the door to a flood of new cases. And actually, that brings up something else that has been bothering me for several weeks now, as you know, because I've said it before, i.e., why aren't the numbers we have right now not dropping? At least not going down more than they are. Quoting again from the piece, a perfectly effective quarantine would therefore reduce practically to zero the number of new cases within a month of being implemented. After 30 days, anyone who'd been sick would have either recovered or died, and because of the quarantine, very few would have gotten sick in the meantime. By March 30th, the overwhelming majority of U.S. states had issued stay-at-home directions. In many cases, those directions had already been in place for weeks, which means by April 30th, 1 month later, anyone who had caught the disease before the lockdowns began should have already passed through the entire life cycle of the disease, either recovering or dying, and that all the new cases we are currently seeing are the result of infections since the shutdown. On April 30th, after a month of which new cases ranged between 25,000 and 30,000 a day, there were 29,500 new reported cases, end quote. So the point I'm making here is, you know how a lot of people have been saying, see, the hospitals never got overwhelmed. See, this was never as bad as everyone feared. And yes, I say thank God for that. But as I also keep saying, the numbers aren't going down. Stop and think about that. We've been in lockdown for how many weeks now? And yes, we've blunted the curve, but we haven't actually broken it. The lockdown that we did that has wrecked our entire economy and has caused suffering for untold numbers of people has gotten us to the point where 30,000 people a day still get the disease and 3,000 people a day can die from it every day. The point I'm trying to underline here is that this was maybe the best we could do. These were maybe the most stringent measures we were willing to undertake to stop this disease. And we did stop it from going exponential, but have we actually stopped it? It doesn't seem like we have. Maybe all we've done is hold the disease in place. In other words, remember all that talk of bending the curve with all of those charts that instead of rising upwards in a scary hockey stick shape, started sloping down in a small hill, but then, they were actually going down? Well, we've not actually seen that. We've not actually achieved the going down part. So what worries me is that the best case scenario right now might be what? We hold things as they are and 3,000 people a day keep dying and 30,000 people a day keep getting the disease. How long does that go on for? 2 more months? 2 more years? And if that is the best case scenario, because if 3 weeks from now, after 3 weeks of reopening, we get a surge and deaths become 5,000 a day and 50,000 or 100,000 people get infected every single day, then what? We've already seen apparently the best that we're capable of doing, and it's right now. So I guess my fear is, what if this is as good as it gets? My biggest worry going into this month is not that we're ending the quarantine per se, because it wasn't as bad as we thought, whatever. It's that we're ending the quarantine, and yet it didn't actually do enough. Quoting from the piece again, under conditions that you might have thought in theory would bring the caseload close to zero in this amount of time, national deaths and caseloads have merely flattened out. Perhaps, depending on how you process the data, they've moved somewhat, but not dramatically downward, end quote. Yeah, remember all of that talk of R0, for example. The whole getting the disease spread rate under 1 as a measure of the disease coming under control. Is it really under 1 if 30,000 people a day are still getting infected? Or remember what I said about Spain in that last segment and how they're seeing an increase of 0.4% in new cases every single day. Why aren't we seeing that here? Or heck, why, after 7 weeks of lockdown, is Spain still seeing any increase in new cases at all? Why is it not yet a decrease? I guess what I'm saying is I'm worried that the lockdowns generally haven't been as effective as we've needed, and I fear we're about to prove that in the worst way possible. And that leads me to my third worry. If you've been listening to us poring over the numbers suggested by those antibody tests, then you probably know where I'm going with this one. Any way you slice the numbers, only a fraction of the population has actually been infected yet. The vast majority of us are still susceptible to catching the disease. It's not like we've all stayed inside these last weeks and thankfully the disease has mostly run its course. Quite the opposite. Final quote from the piece. Since we are only about 1/10 of the way to herd immunity, we'd be expecting probably 10 times more deaths than we've seen to date, for a total number of deaths north of 600,000. That's roughly in line with some of those agent-based projections for unmitigated spread, including this one projecting a median outcome of 556,000 deaths with a high end of 890,000 deaths, end quote. In other words, as I said, I think last week or at some point, are we only in inning 1 of a 9-inning ballgame here? And did we actually accomplish anything with the quarantine? Or were we just effectively dragging out that first inning for a really, really long month? If so, then there might be only 2 very bad scenarios in store for us. The first being, the next innings of this disease will start coming fast and furious, or else the next 8 innings to come will just be as slow and interminable as the first inning was, which means, frighteningly, we might still be seeing 3,000 deaths a day well into 2021. As the coronavirus has continued to spread around the globe, it's been difficult to guess exactly where the next hotspot will be or how hard any particular location might be hit. There are many countries that have seen fatalities in the thousands, while their neighbors have experienced a fraction of that. Some major urban centers like New York City and London have been hit extraordinarily hard, while others like New Delhi, Lagos, or Bangkok have been spared, at least so far. One sobering possibility is that the virus may simply not have spread to some places yet. Another point to consider is how many places are under-testing and some even under-reporting. It's possible some nations have actually felt the brunt of the virus more than it seems from the outside. But for places that haven't seen the worst of the virus so far, the New York Times offers 4 possible explanations as to why: demographics, culture, environment, and the spread of government responses. We now know that young people are not immune to COVID-19. They are, quoting the New York Times, more likely to contract mild or asymptomatic cases that are less transmissible to others, end quote. This, according to Robert Bollinger, a professor of infectious diseases at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. They're also less likely to have health problems that can exacerbate serious symptoms of the virus. So could places with younger average populations be escaping worse outcomes? In Africa, where 60% of people are under the age of 25, there have only been about 45,000 reported cases out of its 1.3 billion total population. Meanwhile, Italy, one of the hardest hit countries, has a median age of over 45. This theory doesn't totally pan out, though. Japan has the world's oldest average population, and it has recorded less than 520 deaths. Plus, quoting the Times, Dr. Jha of Harvard warns that some young people who are not showing symptoms are also highly contagious for reasons that are not well understood, end quote. Another theory is cultural traditions that have social distancing baked in, quoting again. In Thailand and India, where virus numbers are relatively low, people greet each other at a distance with palms joined together as in prayer. In Japan and South Korea, people bow, and long before coronavirus arrived, they tended to wear face masks when feeling unwell. In much of the developing world, the custom of caring for the elderly at home leads to fewer nursing homes, which have been tinder for tragic outbreaks in the West, end quote. There are also nations that are more isolated, have less visitors from abroad, and use less public transportation who have not been hit as hard as their counterparts. There's also the possible factor of warmer climates. Like we reported last week, while hotter temperatures or increased humidity may lead COVID-19 to decay more quickly, the virus is so contagious that it counters out any benefits. But while warmer climates alone may not prevent the spread of the coronavirus, the behavior of people in warmer climates might. Staying cooped up indoors can allow the virus to recirculate and increase the likelihood of contracting it, so warm weather that pushes people outside could be offsetting the spread in some places. A study by ecological modelers at the University of Connecticut also found that UV rays of direct sunlight inhibit the new coronavirus, and therefore surfaces in sunny places may not stay contaminated for as long. But the Times notes, quote, transmission usually occurs through contact with an infected person, not by touching a surface, end quote. Another likely reason the virus has spread in some locations, but not neighboring ones, is how early and effectively places locked down. For instance, many nations in Africa had protocol from their experiences with HIV, drug-resistant tuberculosis, and Ebola that they were likely able to put into place more quickly than places like the U.S. did. The spread has been noticeably low across most of Africa. Likewise, one of the most effective lockdown procedures, according to the World Health Organization, is closing religious centers and sports stadiums. In Iran, where many of the largest shrines were not closed until a month after the first cases were reported there, the virus has spread rapidly and deaths have mounted into the thousands. But again, this reasoning isn't completely consistent. Cambodia and Laos, for example, both enacted lax social distancing measures and, despite brief upticks, haven't reported any new cases in a few weeks. Really, the reason we see more serious spreads in some areas as opposed to others, even when they are right next door to one another, is probably a combination of all of the above. Plus one more. Good old luck. Quoting once more from the Times, countries with the same culture and climate could have vastly different outcomes if one infected person attends a crowded social occasion, turning it into what researchers call a super spreader event. That happened when a passenger infected 634 people on the Diamond Princess cruise ship off the coast of Japan, when an infected guest attended a large funeral in Albany, Georgia, and when a 61-year-old woman went to church in Daegu, South Korea, spreading the disease to hundreds of congregants and then to thousands of other Koreans. Because a single infected person may not experience symptoms for a week or more, if at all, the disease spreads under the radar exponentially and seemingly at random. Had the woman in Daegu stayed home that Sunday in February, the disease in South Korea might have been less than half of what it is, end quote. Every nation is handling things just slightly differently, and even accounting for factors like climate or demographics, there's simply no accounting for human behavior and no accounting for luck. Being stuck at home these days, you're probably not thinking too much about internet privacy because you're on your own home network. Fire up incognito mode on your browser and no one can see what you're doing, right? Wrong. Even in incognito mode, your online activity can still be traced. Even if you clear your browsing history, your internet service provider can still see every single website you've ever visited. That's why even when I'm at home, I never go online without using ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN makes sure your internet service provider can't see what sites you visit. Instead, your internet connection is rerouted through ExpressVPN's secure servers. Each ExpressVPN server has an IP address that's shared among thousands of users. That means everything you do is anonymized and can't be traced back to you. ExpressVPN is the fastest and most trusted VPN on the market. It's rated number one by CNET, Wired, The Verge, and countless others. So protect your online activity today with the VPN that I trust to secure my privacy. Visit my special link at expressvpn.com/report, and you can get an extra 3 months free on a 1-year package. That's expressvpn.com/report. expressvpn.com/report to learn more. My mom said to me just this week that she was sad because she can't send the grandkids care packages for St. Patrick's Day or Easter because she can't go to the post office or the shipping place anymore. I told her, and I swear I am not making this up, there is a solution, Mom. It's stamps.com. Anything you can do at the post office, you can do via stamps.com. Their on-demand postage means you can skip that trip to the post office, which, of course, is something we should all be doing right now, skipping any trips outside that we can avoid otherwise. With stamps.com, you can simply use your computer to print official U.S. postage 24/7 for any letter, any package, any class of mail, anywhere you want to send. Once your mail is ready, just leave it for your mail carrier or drop it in a mailbox. It's that simple. There's no equipment to lease. There are no long-term commitments. Right now, listeners to this show get a special offer that includes a 4-week trial, plus free postage and a digital scale without any long-term commitments. Just go to stamps.com, click on the microphone at the top of the homepage, and type in briefing. That's stamps.com. Enter briefing at the top for your free 4-week trial. You've no doubt heard this several places, a politician or a pundit making specious comparisons between the number of deaths caused by COVID-19 and the number of deaths usually year in and year out caused by the run-of-the-mill flu. Comments like these are often a stepping stone to arguing that the economy should be fully reopened, lockdowns should be ended immediately, or something along those lines. But this is, to be clear, an apples to oranges comparison and always has been. Jeremy Samuel Faust, an emergency room physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard Medical School, blogged about why this is. Quoting from the Washington Post, as Faust describes it, the issue boils down to this. The annual flu mortality figures published by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention are estimates produced by plugging laboratory-confirmed deaths into a mathematical model that attempts to correct for undercounting. COVID-19 death figures represent a literal count of actual people who have either tested positive for the virus or whose diagnosis was based on meeting certain clinical and epidemiological criteria, end quote. So, on the one hand, the flu count is a statistical model extrapolated from actual deaths. The other, the COVID-19 count, is the actual raw number of deaths. No statistical analysis, no correcting for potential undercounts, no anything. An actual apples-to-apples comparison would require going back to the CDC data to find the raw flu death numbers. And doing that, the number of directly confirmed flu deaths for the year 2018-2019 was 7,172. And so far this year, the U.S. COVID-19 death toll stands at more than 67,000. Quoting again from the Post, this year's data are necessarily incomplete as 22 weeks remain in the flu season. There are not likely to be many more flu deaths, however, as we are well past the worst of the season. But COVID-19 mortality has plateaued around 2,000 deaths per day. Where it will head next is anyone's guess. Using an apples-to-apples comparison, we can say that the coronavirus and the disease it causes, COVID-19, have already killed 8 times as many people as the flu. By the time we get data for the entire season, the difference appears to likely be at least tenfold or a full order of magnitude, end quote. And one final quote, this time directly from Dr. Faust's blog post on Scientific American, link in the show notes. Quote, in other words, the coronavirus is not anything like the flu. It is much, much worse, end quote. And finally today, as we are reopening, as some people are going back to work, what might work look like going forward? Well, for one thing, the open office plan, at least as we know it, might be dead, thanks to coronavirus. As businesses start to make plans for employees to return to work, a number of possible solutions have cropped up to keep workers safe, as well as plenty of companies ready to sell their products and services to the cause. Cushman & Wakefield, a commercial real estate company, has created guidelines for offices based on work they did reopening offices they operate in China, quoting Wired magazine. Besides temperature checkpoints, masks, sanitizers, and wipes, the guidelines recommended rearranging desks and meeting room seating to ensure social distancing, having workers use disposable desk covers, and installing dividers between workplaces. Dividers between workplaces, what does that remind you of? Oh yeah, those cubicles that we got rid of in offices over the last couple decades. Michael Boonshoft, a spokesperson at Cushman & Wakefield, says, quote, companies aren't going to have a ton of time and money to create a whole new office concept in a month, so these are quick and inexpensive to implement ideas, end quote. Another company working on redesigning office spaces is Humanize. Ordinarily, they analyze digital and physical communications between workers to optimize productivity. But now they're working with companies like Panasonic to reduce the risk of transmission without sacrificing communication between workers. Ben Weber, the president and co-founder of Humanize, says, quote, at the end of the day, the only reason to be in an office is to collaborate, end quote. So one method they're employing is using anonymous data from smart ID badges to measure workers' movements inside of buildings, but they're also advocating for more low-tech solutions. As Weber says, quote, partitions are really hot right now, end quote. Even other low-tech solutions like staggering shifts are getting an upgrade. Quoting Wired, Appian, which makes apps for workforce management, recently developed one that monitors workers' health and risk through questionnaires, then determines who should come into an office and when, end quote. As far as more high-tech solutions go, there's contact tracing tools for offices. For example, consulting firm PwC developed one version for smartphones. Quoting again, PwC's approach involves mapping the radio signature of an office so that an app on employees' phones can record where they are more accurately than GPS or Bluetooth. If an employee tests positive for COVID-19, the tool can then identify other workers who may have been exposed and should be tested and quarantined, end quote. There's also smart cameras, which could keep an eye on unsafe worker behavior. Quote, Smart Video, which makes AI surveillance systems for identifying unsafe situations at construction sites without identifying individuals, last month developed software to warn managers when workers fail to maintain safe distances from each other. CEO Josh Kanner says it is working on an upgrade that will detect whether workers are wearing masks, end quote. When cubicles first hit the scene in offices in the 1960s, they were seen as a positive change to encourage personalization and intentional communication. Then the whole open office movement of recent years came along, and it promised an evolution towards better communication and productivity. At least that was the intention. So maybe in the coming months or years, we'll see some fusion of the two. Maybe the best of both worlds will rise to the top. But in any case, it's clear the offices that we return to will not function in exactly the same way as the offices we left. That's all for today. I've been Brian McCullough. Jackson Bird will be back with you tomorrow. Be well, everybody.